This is something that came up before. This is a, I believe, continuum fallacy is the term, when you make a point and then somebody else tries to invalidate that point by arguing that you don't have a specific sort of designation along a line. So I said, at a certain point in a market socialist society, the government would probably, have that a business be um, cooperatively owned. And he was like, what, everyone? So if you want to open a lemonade stand, like, well, no, there's probably like a minimum level of yearly income or maybe a minimum level of employees. And then he asked me, how many employees, what income? Obviously, this is fallacious thinking, and I'll call him out on it again if he does it. But from your research, do you have perhaps a general threshold that seems like a decent idea when it comes to when it comes to the like sort of a good threshold to apply the principles of market socialism?
That's actually a really interesting question. So, well, first of all, it definitely is, like you alluded to this, it definitely is a continuum fallacy. And I think a good analogy to use to combat that kind of fallacy is, I think this is the analogy that Ben Burgess uses when he was talking about Ben Shapiro's arguments against the minimum wage, which is that, well, if you think there's a 15 minimum wage, why not $1 billion minimum wage?
Right. Thank you, Ben.
Yeah. And
nailing it as always.
Of course, only the best thinking from the cool kids philosopher. But yeah, so Ben Burgess's example was, if I were to shave my head bald and I were to take a picture of my head and the amount of hair that I have every day for like a few years, not a few years, that's way too much, for like a few months or whatever, my hair is going to grow, and at a certain point I'm not going to be bald. But if you went through the pictures, you would be hard pressed to find or be able to specify like the exact picture in which you stop being bald, because obviously when you have like a little bit of hair on your head, you're still generally considered bald, and there's a certain point at which you're not bald anymore. And it would be incredibly hard, almost maybe even impossible, to find the exact picture in which you objectively stop being a bald person. But that does not mean that the concepts of bald and not bald don't exist as valid concepts, right? So like,
Yeah.
it's just, yeah, like you said, it's incredibly fallacious reasoning. As far as like the specific point,
I think that might be the answer, though. Just analogous reasoning, If you can say something, for example, like Sargon makes claims like this all the time. We need to do something about blank. Oh, we need to do something. What exactly then? At what time should we do something? Or you can say this: we need to combat climate change. Okay, well, how much money exactly do you want to put into it? $36 million. What about 35.8? Do you know? Can you even tell the difference? This nonsense, finagling over the specificities, when in reality, the actual point is that something needs to be done. It is severe. It should be done immediately. And the details of this issue can be settled by bureaucrats. That is their job. That is not our job.
of course, yeah. I mean, yeah, that's certainly the case. I mean, I guess it would just depend, right? Like on the society, or the region, or whatever. But yeah, to expect like ridiculous levels of specificity does not like reject a broad idea or argument that something should be done. Yeah, I definitely agree with you there. But yeah, so if you wanted to get into with that out of the way, is there something else you wanted to get into, or did you want me to bring up a point or something?
Well, I already feel confident in this regard, because Sargon doesn't actually believe in capitalism. Sargon is a fascist. He literally wants to end immigration to the UK. He wants an ethno state.
Oh, really?
He doesn't care about. Oh yeah, yeah,
I didn't
yeah.
know you went that far. Jesus.
No, ending immigration. Yeah. Out of curiosity, how many countries on Earth allow no immigration? I can think of North Korea, and I think Kazakhstan, or Turkmenistan, I'm sorry, might also have a no immigration policy. But apart from that, yeah, North Korea, Turkmenistan, and England. What a world to live in, right?
Yeah, and I mean, like, if you look at the places that do restrict immigration to like an insane extent, it's absolutely fucking horrible for those countries. Like, I mean, Japan is one of like the big ones where like I've argued with so many ethno-nationalists where they're like, Japan lets in hardly any immigration and they're doing great. It's like, no, they're not doing great. They have such a harsh labor shortage that their like economy is being crippled by it. Like, because they're not allowing in immigrant workers. It's just an absurd argument to make.
Yeah, immigration is even North Korea allows immigration in incredibly specific cases. I guess there are expatriates of America who will go over there because they're fucking lunatics.
Right.
To you know, I mean, this does happen.
Yeah.
He made essentially no arguments in the capitalism versus socialism point. The only point he made, I was arguing democracy would be a good idea for the workplace because it increases the happiness and well-being of people who work there. And he said, well, democracy is usually best in places you don't have any other options to go. So he's making the argument that democracy only works if you're forced to stay in a place or something, and he later conceded that point. So I know he's not exactly strong with these issues, but I'd like to make some strong prescriptive arguments for his dumb fuck audience, you know?
Yeah, so, well, the one argument that I remember him making about socialism was like, oh, you think there's a conspiracy to destroy co-ops? Which is just so ridiculous. Like, I mean, you made an excellent point where, like, it's not a conspiracy, it's the way that the economic superstructure of capitalism functions. Like, just co-ops by their nature, like, they're credit constrained, they lack collateral, they have to rely on loans due to the fact that they don't offer control to investors. Like, there's just a variety of like built-in reasons that makes co-ops like disincentivized to be created, which has nothing to do with a conspiracy and everything to do with the fact that the way that co-ops are constructed just doesn't really mesh well with how capitalism typically functions.
Yeah, you agree. You don't think there's anything wrong with keeping it simple and saying that the startup capital from for worker co-ops in a market socialist society could just come from banks or government loans. We don't need to get more into specifics than that. That's probably an acceptable
Yeah.
Point to leave it on, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, like, so this brings me to another point that I've heard. I believe I've heard Sargon make this argument before. This is made a lot by people who like call themselves like libertarians or whatever. Of course, that's not what Sargon is, but economically, he uses libertarianism when it will defend capitalism. He rejects it when it would imply that we should have like more immigrants or whatever, because he's a hack, obviously. But
Right.
Like when it comes to socialism, an argument that people make a lot is, well, in a capitalist economy, you can create a co-op. In a socialist economy, you couldn't create a capitalist business, so capitalism is more voluntary, and that means it's better. And the problem with that argument is that not only is it question begging, but it's also like not true. Like it's based on a false premise. So like, for example, you could say, well, it would be impossible to, make a capitalist business out of a socialist society. And I could say, well, no, it's actually not. Like, even if we had, like, community, collectively owned worker co-ops that are managed, or not managed, but the board of directors are comprised of the workers that are there, all you would have to do to, like, become a capitalist or create a private capitalist business is, for example, convince enough of your community to democratically allow you to be the sole capitalist. And then you would say, well, that's true, you could do that, but why would you do that? And it's true, or why would they do that? Why would they allow you to become a capitalist? Because it's not in their interests. And the counter argument to that would be, it is true, it would be very hard to create a capitalist enterprise out of socialism, but that's not disanalogous to the ability of socialists to create co-ops out of capitalism, because similarly, creating a co-op in capitalism is extremely hard. So it's actually like not disanalogous as far as the level of how voluntary it is.
And even beyond the question begging and the you know the factual incorrectness of the argument, you could also say, like, even if that was the case, that's applicable to other, you know, paradigm changes in our economy as well. You know, in feudalism, you know, you could claim your birthright by seizing control of a castle and exerting your lordship over the local peasantry. In capitalism, you can't do that, at least not in name. So, in that sense, feudalism is actually a more free system than capitalism, because in feudalism you could, you know, technically run a private business. You'd have to pay taxes, same as you would here. The argument that you can do more things is not an argument that a system is better if the things you are doing are not moral.
Mm-hmm.
I imagine there are plenty of things you could get away with, actually, in a feudal society that you probably couldn't get away with today. And
Yeah,
it's probably for the better.
exactly. Like, and the same goes for like slave society. Like, if somebody's ever like, well, you can, you know, create a capitalist enterprise in a socialist society, it's not free. Well, you can just say, well, you can't rape your slave in a capitalist society, so therefore it's not as free as slavery.
Damn,
Like,
where'd that freedom go?
Right. It just doesn't follow at all. Like, and I don't know. I just feel like it's this really shallow view of freedom where they're like, well, technically you have the freedom to do any of these things. And it's like, yeah, but for the vast majority of people, like 60% of Americans are like living paycheck to paycheck or some ridiculous number like that. It's like the concept that you have the right to do these things is kind of made moot by the fact that practically nobody has the means to exercise the freedom because of the mechanisms of capital which work to crush wages to maximize profits.
Yeah, it's a matter of practical freedom. You know, it's what's that quote? You know, in a free society, it is equally illegal for the rich man and the poor man to sleep beneath the bridge at night, and it is equally legal for both of them to form super PACs to advocate and fund the candidates who represent their interests.
Right.
A free society,
Yeah.
right? It's about practical freedom. Not so much the actual legal limitations of your behavior, which are for most people quite meaningless. Most laws, specifically the ones that direct, you know, the behavior of the wealthy or of the political elite, which are already superseded in so many ways. But even those existing laws are irrelevant to the vast majority of the population. They don't reflect at all on how we live our lives or how capable we are of affecting government processes.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I completely agree with that. Like, I don't know. The arguments are just like they try to draw all of these like disanalogies between capitalism and socialism that aren't actually disanalogies at all. Like in your debate with Sargon, like I think another one of the points he made was, correct me, I mean I watched a ridiculous amount of debates on YouTube, so I might be mixing up your debate.
No, please go ahead.
Else, but I think I recall him saying something like, you said like there should be like political action to bring about socialism or whatever, and he was like, so you're talking about babying them or something like that.
What?
Did he say that?
No, he does. No, well, yes, of course, he does this all the time. You know, anytime you say, "Well, I believe action should be taken," they'll say, like, "What?" Well, then either that to him, this means either A, that means people don't already want it, or B, that you have to sort of cajole them through government force into believing. It's this nonsensical, you know, sort of extrapolation from the argument, but he'll do it like every single time. Meanwhile, he wants to ban immigration, which is one of the most authoritarian things you could possibly do.
Right.
But you know, what's up?
Yeah.
Pasta? Oh no, I'm still full.
Okay. Well, I can also make it for later.
Well, I'll never say no to later pasta.
No, I'll make it now. Love you.
Love you.
Oh, let me know when you're done if I'm not back.
Yeah. All right, sorry.
No, that's all right. Yeah, and I mean, so he made this argument. I know that Tiny has made the same argument where, you know, he's said to Ben Burgess, he was like, oh, you want, you know, to give preferential loans to worker co-ops, you must be admitting that they're not as efficient or something like that. And so this argument is one that they make a lot. It's like, it's an argument against making or having political action against social. It's an argument about if you say that there should be political action that should be taken to propagate the rise of socialism, and they somehow infer that that's like wrong, or that's an infringement on freedom, or it means it's less efficient or something like that. And that point is just, it's so defeated by the history of capitalism. Like, do they think that capitalism just emerged out of feudalism by people saying, like, we want to be capitalists now? No, like runaway.
I don't know why you would ask me that when you know perfectly well that's exactly what they think.
Yeah, but like the problem with like that characterization is like that's obviously not how it happened. Like the history of feudalism's emergence out of capitalist society was serfs started essentially created, like runaway serfs started creating like enclaves of capitalism, and feudal societies would try to break up these enclaves and you know, sabotage them. So eventually, these capitalist enclaves and these capitalist enterprises started essentially creating like political parties and political, like they started levying their votes and their political power to get the monarchies and so on to, or whatever governing system they lived in, to influence that system to give them preferential treatment so that they could compete against the feudalists more effectively. And so it was political action that capitalists engaged in to get the powers that be to give them preferential treatment that allowed capitalism to emerge out of feudal society. So like the argument that socialism would require that is ridiculous. Like, and not only that, but it's completely irrelevant. Like, even if I were to grant you, okay, no political action should be taken to achieve socialism, that's not an argument that socialism is bad or that socialism isn't good. Because say I were to advocate for, okay, no political action is bad. I think the mass of working people should sort of like take their retirement funds and you know, levy their consuming power and economic firepower in order to naturally, without any government involvement, create a society built on worker co-ops or worker co-ops of a dominant mode of production. That doesn't require any political action, but it could still bring about socialism. So the argument against political action does not translate to an intrinsic argument against socialism.
And even then, there's nothing inherently immoral about political action as a concept. Every not even non-major, every meaningful social, economic, and political change is, or at least in almost all cases, is in some way accompanied by or enabled by policy. In fact, the social changes that are usually least dependent on policy and on the involvement of political actors are usually progressive ones, because those tend to be bottom up rather than top down. You know, the machinations of higher business usually have to be pushed through policy, which is easy for them because they have inroads in our government. Whereas stuff like, you know, the gay rights movement or what have you, or the civil rights movement happens, you know, very largely due to public action before the legislators get even slightly involved.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, like, even in addition to that, like, it's still a question, like, it's an inherently question-begging argument, because they're basically saying socialism shouldn't happen because it would have political action, which, again, is a false premise. But even granting it, they're saying socialism is bad because there's political action and things should kind of be decided by just letting market mechanisms do their thing and letting the chips fall where they may in like a market context. But the idea, the premise that they're smuggling in is that things should be decided through these like the natural mechanisms of the market. So essentially, when you actually look at the argument, what it boils down to is capitalism is good because capitalism is good, without giving us any reason to buy into that premise. So like it's inherently question begging.
That's also contrary to some of his other opinions, because the natural machination of the markets would lead towards open borders. So if he opposes that, he would have to give a very strong reason why the state should be able to take an incredibly authoritarian move to shut down the borders of the country, harming the country and its citizens, you know, pushing inflation, hurting the broader GDP, hurting like broader trade deals, making goods rise in their costs, again, all through government policy, not at all through any like bottom up, you know, public advocacy. And that's fine. But some pithy little project to give preferential funding towards worker co-ops, which have been empirically demonstrated to perform at par with, or sometimes even better than, traditional firms when it comes to, sustainability, worker happiness, ability to withstand market fluctuations and the like.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, like, I just find it hilarious. Like, I feel like there's some honest conservatives, but I feel like anybody who thinks that Sargon is like an honest actor is just like so like out of their depth. Like Sargon's philosophy is literally so inconsistent. Sargon's philosophy is basically government intervention is okay, but only when it's against brown people. Or, like, there's just no consistency.
Well, I don't think any of his audience because his positions are incoherent ideologically. I think his audience just likes the owning the lib component, and I think a lot of them are sort of lulled to sleep by his accents. I really do think it's that. I think that Sargon, if he was an American, would have a quarter, if that, of the views. I really, really do think a lot of it is just Americans assigning intelligence to people with that accent. But yeah, it's the owning the libs thing for the most part, which is why it's super important I stay calm the next time I debate him, as frustrating as he is, and condescend as aggressively as I can then too. I'm probably gonna have to go soon. Are there any like final hidden leaf ninja village Sharingan technique capitalism versus socialism finishers that you would like to impart upon me?
I'm about to hit you with the alternate Rasengan of socialist arguments.
All right, gotcha. The Kenkai Genshin of political theory. Hit me up.
All right, so I'll just make this argument really quick. This is I intended to start with this. Obviously, I got a bit off track, but so the argument from overaccumulation, I think it's one of the most convincing arguments for socialism. So first of all, it's a crisis theory, so it explains why recessions happen, why they have a tendency to get worse over time, and so the first thing when you're arguing crisis theory, the first thing you have to understand is any argument that Sargon or whoever else will try and make, where they'll try to say, this is what Adam Friend did try to say, and I shut him down with the counter argument that I'm about to give you. This is what I've heard a lot of people say, where they will try to explain the crisis of capitalism on some factor which isn't intrinsic to capitalism. They'll say either this is something like innovation, just something natural, or it's just human behavior, or they'll say, oh, it's just a specific thing that we've had with capitalism, like it's the Federal Reserve or whatever. But the ultimate shutdown to all of those arguments is that if you look at the empirical record, whenever and wherever capitalism has ever existed from its very beginning, it has had a recession on average every 4 to 7 years. This instability did not exist before capitalism, and it has existed within capitalism regardless of government policies or culture or whatever else. So the empirical record clearly suggests that whatever causes crisis is something which is internal to the basic structure of capitalism and which has existed only in capitalism and has never been overcome by any modifications to capitalism. So any arguments that try to assert that this is something which isn't specific to capitalism or isn't intrinsic to capitalism is just complete nonsense. Like, it's just completely contradicted by the empirical record.
Could you explain to me the mechanisms which lead to this cycle?
Yeah. So that's the point of overaccumulation theory. So the mechanism is so basically in the normal process of capital circulation, a capitalism basically invests to buy fixed capital and labor, and the capitalist uses these things to produce a surplus, and a portion of this surplus is injected back into production to multiply the surplus. So, like, a good example would be like I sell like a piece of lemonade, or a piece of lemonade. I sell like some lemonade. It makes me like $10. I spent $5 making lemonade. I use the extra money that I earned to make more lemonade too. So basically, the surplus that capitalists make, the purpose of it is to be reinvested to multiply itself. And basically, a crisis of overaccumulation occurs when the surplus that capitalists have available to them cannot find an outlet through which to be profitably invested. So
Right.
if I've accrued a large surplus from selling things and I don't have anywhere to invest the surplus, that's an overaccumulation situation. And so the reason that this causes crisis is because when overaccumulation happens on a massive scale, and a portion of the overaccumulated capital, when the surplus of many capitalists cannot be profitably invested, a portion of the overaccumulated capital that can't be invested will then have to be devalued until what survives can seek satisfactorily profitable investment again. So as a result, asset prices then have to plunge, firms go bankrupt, physical inventories languish, wages are reduced, countless people's lives and futures are destroyed, suicides skyrocket, that sort of thing. All very, very fun outcomes.
Right.
Yeah, and so basically that's the mechanism, is when when a bunch of capitalists have overaccumulated capital, they can't profitably invest it, then that capital has to be devalued until it can be profitably invested, and this causes like massive shutdown of corporations, the decline of wages, all of this stuff. And so
Why would this process not continue in a market socialist society?
Okay, so that is one point to touch on. So hold on, I'll get to that. All right, I have okay. So essentially, the reason that this wouldn't happen in a market socialist society is because like the only reason that overaccumulation happens is because there are certain blockage points in the circulation of capital, right? So specific blockage points would include underconsumption, a falling rate of profit, a profit squeeze, monopolization. So like, for example, the way that Richard Wolff describes the 2008 crisis is capitalists over a long period of time depressed the wages of their workers as much as possible. And so workers' wages got depressed so much that they couldn't buy back what the capitalists were selling, and this led to like a massive crisis. And so there's a variety of mechanisms, and that was an example of an overaccumulation theory, because since nobody could buy what they were selling, they couldn't profitably invest their surplus. And so out of all of the potential causes of an overaccumulation, whether it be a falling rate of profit or underconsumption, like how Richard Wolff explains in 2008, that'd be a crisis of underconsumption. If you look at the commonalities among the potential causes of overaccumulation, the only reason that all of these mechanisms exist or have the potential to be manifested in the form of an economic crisis is because of the antagonistic nature of class society. So a good way to illustrate this would be, theoretically, there could exist a situation wherein like the ideal proportion is reached between the total social income to be reinvested in production and the total social income to be spent on consumption, with like the credit system serving to maintain the ratio of profits to wages in an economically stable way that wouldn't create an overaccumulation crisis. But the profit-driven and antagonistic nature of capitalist society prevents this sort of stability from being reached, because if there's a class divide, then you have capitalists wanting like one thing, capitalists saying, oh no, we're gonna try and maximize our profits as much as possible, and then you have the workers struggling against the capitalists. But if you were to create a scenario in which basically everybody had the same class interest, because everybody lives in the same society, the workers are owning their own companies, and they're the board of directors, and there's no more antagonism between workers and capitalists, the sort of balance that would need to be reached to ensure stable growth could take place, because everybody now has like the same class interests rather than this like disorganized antagonistic struggle between capitalists and workers.
So the crisis of overaccumulation is a natural product of the dissonant interests of the bourgeois and proletariat classes, one which would be alleviated if the people making the widespread economic decisions in our country were also the people who had to live with the consequences of those decisions.
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay. All right. All of this is way, way, way above par for any kind of conversation Sargon is capable of having, but it's nice to have it.
Useful, I mean.
Thank you very much for talking with me. I appreciate it.
Hey, no problem. Thanks for chatting with me.
Of course. Keep up the good work with your stuff. I enjoy your debates.
Hey, thank you.
Anyway, I appreciate the political theory lesson. Maybe one day I will actually get around to reading theory, but until then, I will continue to have to rely on the better educated people. So thank you again.
Hey, no problem.